Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Peter Blair Henry on the subject of his new book, Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsty School of International Affairs. Every week on the program, we welcome an expert in global governance, international public policy, or international affairs to the program. Today we welcome Dr. Peter Blair Henry to the program. Dr. Henry is Dean of New York University's Stern School of Business and former professor of international economics at Stanford University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
As you know, and as you note in the introduction of your book, macroeconomists rarely agree on strategies for economic growth. And in fact, again, as you note, the debates around these strategies tend to be very politicized and very polemic. What prompted you to write your book in the first place?
I wanted to write the book because I wanted to, frankly, get away from, as you say, this polemicism. If you talk to economists on the left and you talk to economists on the right and you ask the question, if we look over the last 35 years, has the reform agenda, the so-called Washington Consensus, been helpful or harmful to developing countries, formerly third world countries, now emerging markets? You get very different answers. So one view is that the reform agenda has largely been pushed by advanced nations, only to the benefit of advanced nations, and in fact hasn't done much to help these countries. Another view says, no, in fact, the Washington Consensus, the reform agenda would have done a lot to help these countries if they had only followed it. Right. And so the question is, well, how do you get away from this? How do you actually figure out whether policies actually help countries to become more efficient and to grow and to help lift people out of poverty? And so I wanted to write the book to get away from the polemicism and actually to try to answer these questions in a dispassionate and useful way.
So broadly speaking then, what are some of the experiences of the developing world that are transferable to developed economies? So what can the first world learn from third world growth?
Well, I think there are really three key principles. Right? So as you said, it's what's required for countries to grow differs depending on the country. So there's very specifics or the tactics, if you will, of that strategy. But there are three key lessons that transfer across strategies and across countries. And those three key lessons that former third world countries learned in turning themselves around to become today's emerging markets that advanced countries need to learn are discipline, clarity, and trust. So discipline does not mean fiscal austerity.
Right.
Discipline means a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy. So an example would be if you're Korea and you want to drive export-led growth, well then you need to have exchange rate policy that's consistent with being competitive in an external environment, for instance. Clarity. Countries turn themselves around once leaders demonstrated a clear commitment to a change of direction. So in other words, once you have a disciplined strategy in mind, you have to clearly communicate that and demonstrate very clearly that you're committed to carrying that out. And then trust is critical because discipline and clarity are what produce trust. And trust, as we know, is essential to the functioning of a market economy. In order for what we call arm's length transactions to happen, in other words, transactions that happen between not necessarily two people who know each other, but anonymous market participants, we have to believe in the institution of the market. There has to be trust in order for that to work.
And throughout the book, you do make the case that the stock market is a tremendously important gauge of both disciplined policies and efficient policies. Can you explain for our audience why the stock market is such an important gauge?
Yeah, the stock market is a helpful indicator because the stock market doesn't, going back to the issue of the political divide, the stock market doesn't care about whether policies are left-leaning policies or right-leaning policies. The stock market cares about whether policies are likely to create or destroy value in the marketplace. And so if you look at how the stock market responds, what does the stock market care about? It cares about whether profits are going to be higher in the future and whether interest rates, or what we call risk premia, are going to be higher or lower. So if a policy is likely to reduce interest rates and reduce risk and raise profits, the stock market will respond positively. If the stock market thinks that policies are likely to lead to lower profits, well, the stock market will respond negatively. So if we look at how the stock market responds when a government announces a decision to open its markets to free trade, for instance, if you look at something like the NAFTA agreement between the United States and Canada, to be one example, and Mexico, of course, then that gives you an indication of whether the market expects that policy to be good for the economy as a whole. Now, one question that naturally arises in this is, well, the stock market is just an indication of whether shareholders are going to be better off.
Right.
But the key link to the economy as a whole happens through the cost of raising capital for firms.
Right. Great. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to continue this discussion in the second segment. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Peter Blair Henry. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back to the program. Peter, I'd like to pick up on our discussion of discipline. And why is it so hard for developed economies?
I think it's a really critical point we have to understand. Developed economies once taught developing economies what discipline actually means. That was almost 30, 35 years ago, as countries were coming out of the 1970s, as countries were evolving kind of after the Cold War, and advanced economies have forgotten, frankly. We've forgotten the lessons that we taught other countries about how to run their economies. And so I think it's very hard for us in advanced economies like the United States, Canada less so. I think Canada's in many ways been much more disciplined than the United States over the past decade. But it's hard for advanced economies to look at developing countries and say, you know what? We're actually suffering from the same issues that they suffered from 30 years ago. And one example would be fiscal discipline. So fiscal discipline does not mean fiscal austerity. It does not mean rapid reduction of deficits overnight, as we're seeing in the United States with sequestration, or you saw in Europe in 2010 with extreme fiscal consolidation under the European Fiscal Compact. Fiscal discipline just means saving for a rainy day. It means running surpluses in good times, so that in bad times, you can run deficits to stimulate the economy. You know, my favorite example of this is the story of Andres Velasco, the Chilean finance minister. In 2006, Chile was running a huge fiscal surplus. People of Chile took to the streets and burned Andres Velasco in effigy, saying, "Give us our money back." And Velasco said, "No, it's money for a rainy day." And so when the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, Chile was able to run deficits, be able to put in place a stimulus program to help the poor and help stimulate the economy. No trick in the story of the ant and the grasshopper.
Right. Well, and that, I think, leads nicely into my next question, and that's leadership. And as many of the case studies in your book show, you don't win any popularity contests by pushing for some of these reforms. So how crucial is leadership to this and the ability to look past the moment to even decades beyond when the results of these reforms will actually come to fruition?
Yeah, leadership plays a central role. And, you know, I talked about clarity earlier. And leaders need to be clear. And leaders need to be clear that their commitment is to what's good for the country or what's good for any individual or interest group running for political office. And that's part of being disciplined. I think one story that really sticks in my mind is the story of Prime Minister Erskine Sandiford in Barbados, a small country of Barbados. In the 1990s, Barbados was suffering from an overvalued exchange rate. They were about to run out of foreign exchange. IMF went to Barbados and said they had to devalue. The Prime Minister's leadership team said, no, we actually want to do something different. And so instead of just protesting the IMF recommendation, they said, we're going to cut wages instead of devaluing the currency. That's how we're going to restore competitiveness. This was a very hard thing to push through because you can imagine people don't like having their wages cut. And so to cut to the chase of the story, the leadership pushed through this wage cut. As a result, the economy was able to recover very quickly. And they didn't run out of foreign exchange. And so as a result of this wage cut, though, the Prime Minister and his party were kicked out of office and did not return to power for 14 years. And the prime minister himself actually never was prime minister again. And when asked in retrospect, was this too high a price to pay? Was this too high a price to pay? He said, no. This is a small price to pay to save the country.
Wow.
So that's clarity. And we need that kind of clarity.
You also make the case that we need a lot of humility. And there isn't necessarily a lot of that in the first world economies. How much is this hurting the chances of actually being disciplined or enacting policy-efficient reforms?
I think it plays a major role. It plays a major role in that if you think about what's going on right now in the United States and in Europe, we have fiscal policy, we have monetary policy on the one hand, very expansionary, trying to stimulate the economy. Quantitative easing in the United States, outright monetary transactions in the European Central Bank. And on the other hand, you have contractionary fiscal policy. So that's a distinct lack of clarity, things working against one another. And our inability or our unwillingness to actually look at the lessons from these developing countries and say, you know what? We actually need to be more disciplined and realize that fiscal policy needs to work in conjunction with monetary policy to drive a recovery. But we tend to forget, again, that discipline runs in cycles.
Okay.
And that we need to learn from history. And in fact that we, who were once the teachers, now need to become the students.
Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Peter Blair Henry. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back to the program. Peter, I'd like to ask you about the Washington Consensus and specifically how you respond to critics of the consensus who suggest that the cure or the pill was worse than the disease.
I think the important thing to remember about the Washington Consensus, it was really a list of 10, broadly speaking, policy reforms, policy areas in which countries could make changes to help improve their economies. The important thing is not to do all 10 those things on the list all at once, but going back to the definition of discipline, figuring out what is in the best interest of the country and figuring out how to harness the market to drive prosperity, and figuring out whether it's reducing inflation, as in the case of Brazil, opening up to free trade in the case of South Korea, privatization in the case of Eastern Europe, figuring out where on that list of 10 things you can get the most bang for your buck. And so I think that there's a big misunderstanding about what reform actually means. Right? So I think that's really the key thing. And we see that countries that actually implement disciplined reforms, the stock market anticipates that these reforms will create value in these countries. And in fact, it does. We also look at wages and growth. Big improvements in these countries as a result of making reforms.
Now you do acknowledge that with reforms, there can be short-term pain.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And that with these reforms, certain parts of the economy are displaced, at least temporarily. And you make the case for the importance of government programs to help mitigate the hurt. Can you say a little bit, why has this part of the equation, why is that also under assault?
Yeah.
Especially in the US.
So I think, again, if you think about how people tend to bring their own predispositions to problems. And what I try to do in this book is to say, yes, the markets can do a lot, but there's also a role for government. And so this book is not an apology for people who say, the free markets are all that are needed, right? It's to say that markets are a necessary but not sufficient condition for addressing most of the big challenges facing society. And if you want to do what's good for the country as a whole, and some people are going to suffer as a result of making those changes that are good for the whole, then you better have some solutions in mind as to how do you actually help those people who are going to be hurt. Otherwise, the political economy is not going to work. So for reasons of very practical reasons, as well as reasons of wanting to be compassionate, it's important to think about the role that government can play in actually helping to mitigate the impact of economic reform.
You also caution against the temptation to enact protectionist policies in times of economic uncertainty. Why is open trade such an important part of any economic growth strategy?
Trade plays a critical role because it allows countries to do what they do best. It reduces the cost of producing goods and services. So we tend to look at trade issues only from the point of view of workers. So workers who perhaps get hurt when we open up to free trade, whether it be in cars or bananas, and that displaces workers in the auto industry or in agriculture. But we forget that there also are consumers, and consumers who can consume goods more cheaply as a result of free trade are better off. And typically there are more consumers in any economy than there are workers in any particular industry.
Right.
But also, free trade allows us to bring in new ideas, new ways of doing things, and leads to innovation. So the key is to, again, harness the power of free trade to reduce the cost of goods and services for consumers in the economy, to bring in new technology, but acknowledging that when we open up to free trade, whether it be in Brazil or Great Britain, there are going to be costs associated with that, and there's an important role that government has to play in helping, making sure A, its workers are educated, B, that workers have health care that's not tied to their employers necessarily, so that they can have insurance that goes with them no matter where they're employed.
Right.
Would be another example that would be optimal.
Okay. You also talk about inflation as one of the elements that really needs to be brought under control in order for these reforms to be effective. How does inflation factor into these third world experiences?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Inflation is not something we worry about a lot anymore, but as recently as the early 1990s, inflation in Brazil was 3,000% per year.
Right.
When inflation is 3,000% per year, it's hard for someone who's getting a paycheck to think about anything other than how do I get this paycheck out of my hands as quickly as possible and into a bank so that my paycheck doesn't get eroded in value. And it makes it very hard to plan in investment decisions. Makes it very hard to concentrate on anything other than evading the costs of high inflation. So inflation was a scourge that really undermined productivity in many places in the developing world for a very long time. And we do see places now, Venezuela, Argentina, where inflation is on the rise again. So it's very important, even though inflation is currently low in most parts of the world, that we not forget the ills that come from high inflation.
Right. When we come back, I want to talk about the global picture. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Peter Blair Henry. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back to the program. As you note in the book, with perhaps the exception of the G20, the emerging economies that are now major drivers of the global economy have not necessarily reaped the rewards of greater voice or representation within the international financial institutions, specifically the World Bank and the IFI and the International Monetary Fund. Issues of fairness aside, why is this inequity so problematic for future economic growth?
In a word, it's interconnectedness. So because emerging markets are driving global growth, we need emerging markets who are at this point in time experiencing a slowdown. So we're expecting 5% growth for emerging markets in 2013. In order for emerging markets to get back to higher growth rates, which are critically important in order to pull the advanced economies along, which are continue to struggle, emerging markets need to continue down the path of economic reform. This relates to the issue of representation at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions, because where did the seeds of this ideas of a reform agenda come from? Well, they were pushed very hard by precisely these institutions. So in order for leaders in emerging economies to have the credibility that they need to continue to drive reform agendas, which, as we've been discussing, are very hard to do.
Right.
Right? It is important that they be able to say publicly, nationally, to their constituents, we are being recognized for the achievements we've had as a result of turning around our economies by following these very hard lessons, and are reaping the benefits in terms of our ability to promote our own agenda as part of an international agenda through these institutions. And the inability or the lack of willingness of the advanced nations to recognize this, recognize that this isn't just good manners, it's good business for them, stands in the way of a really robust recovery.
And building on that point of interconnectivity, you mentioned in the book that first world prosperity depends on third world growth. And could you say a little bit more about this?
Yeah. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund tells us that for every 2 percentage points of lower growth in emerging markets, so if emerging markets go from 7% growth to 5% growth, that lowers growth rates in the United States by about half a percentage point. And that's really significant because half a percentage point in the United States is millions of jobs.
Sure.
So that's why it matters. And we're seeing the seeds of discontent beginning to sprout kind of shoots of bitter fruit, if you will, in emerging economies. So just earlier this year, the emerging markets decided to set up their own development bank, this BRICS development bank. And we're seeing more movement to bilateral trade agreements. Now, why does all this matter? All this matters because we need an the world is interconnected, and we need a recognition that we need multilateral systems in order to drive not just regional trade agreements, but global trade agreements, and global financial flows and global cooperation on financial issues. And so if we have emerging markets saying, you know what, if the advanced nations are going to not recognize us, we're going to essentially pick up our ball and go home and set up our own development bank. Well, that begins to lead to a slippery slope of bilateralism instead of multilateralism. And it begins to lead you into a world, as we talked about earlier, of protectionism, currency wars, and other things which are zero-sum as opposed to positive-sum.
So why isn't there more sort of enlightened self-interest on both sides? If both sides recognize that we're in this together and that it's mutually advantageous to engage in more multilateralism as opposed to this temptation to bilateralism or regionalism and protectionism, why isn't there more enlightened self-interest?
Well, I think we need more awareness, for a start, of just how connected large domestic economies like the United States are to the global economy. I think that's the first step. And then I think it gets back to this issue of can we be humble enough to say, gee, actually, yes, there have been tremendous strides made by these emerging economies, and in fact, we can learn something from them. And in fact, we should also begin to reciprocate and recognize the strides they've made, and in fact, hold them accountable by giving them greater voice in these institutions and saying, okay, take a bigger leadership role. Now we've given you the capital to go back home and make some of these big policy changes that need to continue to happen to drive growth there. Let's see what you're going to do. So it's a question of sharing responsibility.
Is the G20 a good forum for fostering this kind of normative shift?
Well, the G20 has done some very positive things. So if you go back to the fall of 2010, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors actually approved IMF reform, which would have moved 2 of the 24 seats on the IMF board from Europe to the more dynamic emerging economies. The challenge is that one member of the G20, a very large member of the G20 called the United States, has not been able to get its Congress, the United States Congress, to ratify the quota increase on the part of the United States that would be necessary to drive this forward. So we have domestic politics in the United States standing in the way of global prosperity.
And I guess just to build on that, what is the role of the U.S. in essentially breaking these deadlocks? And I guess do all roads lead to Washington ultimately for getting us back on track?
Well, I guess it's called the Washington Consensus for a reason.
Right.
The United States will continue to play a critical role. And in particular with respect to the international financial institutions, which require on major issues like IMF reform, an 85% consensus vote of the body, and the United States holds a 17% vote, well, it effectively has veto power. So yes, the United States is critically important, and we need a continued raising of awareness, not just of decision makers in the United States, but of the broader population of how much of our prosperity is really linked to embracing positive sum rather than zero sum outcomes.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Peter. This has been absolutely wonderful. And
thank you.
Thank you to our audience for watching. Please join us again on Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.